On today's episode of Faith in Focus, I want to recap a lesson I gave at my church this past Sunday. I just started teaching through the book of Proverbs, so this was the first lesson I gave in the series I'm going to be giving, and I kind of wanted to recap a little bit of what I talked about, because I think that our world is starved for wisdom, and the book of Proverbs gives incredible insight on how to gain wisdom and avoid foolishness. So I want to talk about the most innocent kind of fool that the Proverbs talk about, and this is the naive simpleton. So that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. The book of Proverbs, in my opinion, is, if not the funniest book, it's definitely got to be up there in the top 5 funniest books in the Bible, because it's so blunt. When you read through the book of Proverbs, it's just like, especially, after you get through the first couple chapters where they're more kind of speeches about wisdom and foolishness, but when you start to get into the section that is just rapid fire Proverbs, one after the other, some of them are so funny, and the pictures that they paint just make you laugh. And if you can read it in a more modern language, sometimes if you read the KJV or some of the older translations, the language, the kind of the archaic language, you might get bogged down in some of that. But if you read it in a more modern language, something that translates it to something that's just really easy to understand, you're not getting you're not belaboring through the language, and you can actually just understand what it's saying. Sometimes it's just so funny. We often quote at our church an old deacon who, when the pastor's child was born, paraphrased a proverb, kind of put it into modern language, and he said, "Beat him, it will not kill him." And it's so funny, those proverbs like that, discipline a child, it will not kill him. It's like, that's funny to think about. It just, they're very quick and witty, and you can picture the image that's trying to be portrayed in the proverbs. So it's very funny, and sometimes because it's very funny, the opposite of it being funny is it's very convicting. When you find yourself at the receiving end of a proverb, you realize, oh, this is not so much funny as it is very quick-witted and cutting, and it cuts right to the matter. So I love the book of Proverbs, and as I encouraged the church that I was teaching at this weekend, my local church here, I tried to encourage the people. It's such a great book, and there's no reason not to read it. So if you're somebody who struggles in getting in time to read the Word every single day, maybe you don't have a reading plan that you stick to rigidly, and maybe you just struggle to find 5 minutes a day to read the Word, just open up your phone whenever you have even 3 minutes. It doesn't take that long to read a chapter, 5 minutes. Whenever you've got a few minutes, and whatever day of the month it is. Today is the 26th day of the month, as of recording. You just open up to Proverbs 26 and read the 26th chapter, and there's 31 chapters in the book of Proverbs. So any day of the month will have you covered, and you can get a chapter in, and it's all about wisdom. It's about how to receive wisdom. And the other thing I encouraged the people in my Bible study to do, not only because it's such a easy mnemonic device to remember what to read, what chapter to read, and what day of the week, or what day of the month rather. It's also, there's such an invitation in Scripture, and we'll look a little bit at that a little bit later. But there's such an invitation to gain wisdom, so much so that I shared with the people that in James chapter 1, verse 5, we're told that If any of you lacks wisdom, you can ask God, and he will give it to anyone who asks liberally. And as the King James says, and he upbraideth not, meaning he shows no prejudice in doing so. And sometimes I think we get the idea that, oh, if I've sinned too much, if I've done too much bad things, and I try to ask God for something, he's going to tell me no. And we can debate the mechanics of prayer all day long, as far as, does certain things hinder certain prayers from God. But one thing that I'm fairly confident of is that asking for wisdom from God, that's going to be a prayer that God will answer. First of all, because it says so in James. He will answer that prayer. And if you don't believe that he will answer the prayer, you might as well not ask anything from God, because this is the one thing he's guaranteed to answer. So if you do not even believe he'll answer this, don't ask for anything else, because you're not even believing the one thing that's guaranteed. But secondly, usually if we've sinned or done something really foolish, what we need is wisdom. So God is just eager for us to ask for wisdom so that we can avoid, the pitfalls that we fell in before. So he wants to give us wisdom. He wishes we'd ask for wisdom before we did the stupid thing that we did. So there's all these reasons to gain wisdom. And then when you read through the book of Proverbs, you realize that wisdom is essentially skill. That is the Hebrew word. Hakmah is skill. So you can be skilled, like, Michael Jordan would have great hakmah in putting a basketball through a hoop. He has great skill in doing that. Tiger Woods, same thing, putting a little golf ball in a cup. So, hakmah, skill. And so when we're asking for wisdom, we're asking for skill in living, how to navigate through life. And life is complicated. There's so many moving parts that it's almost impossible to think, how do we move through life successfully in all of our interactions, our business dealings, our relationships, the decisions we have to make. How can we walk through life without stepping on a landmine? And that's what wisdom, Proverbs, is supposed to impart to us as people. It's supposed to give us the skills that we need to navigate through life. And so when you look in Proverbs chapter 1, it kind of opens with those bullet points of what the Proverbs are intended to do. So verse 2, for instance, to learn wisdom and moral instruction, and to discern wise counsel. So, to learn not only what the right course of action is, to be able to discern when people are giving you advice and say, no, that's foolish. That does not make any sense. And sometimes when you look at the politicians that we are graced with, you hear their policy decisions and you just think, that is not smart. That is not the way to go. That's going to cause all these different problems. And it's almost like sometimes people have policy decisions that how did they not see the foolishness of their choices that they're making? But so the Proverbs helps in that way. To receive moral instruction and skillful living and righteousness, justice, and equity. So those buzzwords, justice, equity, everyone's striving for justice and equity. And businesses, HR departments, schools, organizations, churches, it's all we're fighting for justice and equity. And I would just challenge you, those are obviously incredibly lofty and valuable goals to strive for. And I think that rightly understood, that's what we as the church should be striving for, is justice, equity, righteousness, rightness. But the world is also striving for that. And what I would challenge you with is be very cautious. Maybe this is wise counsel, to just be able to discern wise counsel. If the world is seeking after something, equity and justice, and the church is also seeking after justice and equity, maybe we need to be very, very, very cautious about fighting for those goals in the same way that the world system does. Okay? So the world system right now, especially in America, has a desire to see equity, equal outcome, and just this equality across the board. And really, it's equal outcomes, right? Equality as far as under the law, that's should be a given. That should be um, a legal goal that we can pursue, and we should be striving for. And equality before God, we would certainly, as Christians, believe that, and our founding documents would certainly pr- propose that we are all equal by virtue of being created by our Creator. And but equity is something different. Equity is equality of outcome, right? So if you play the game of Monopoly, everyone is equal when you start. Everyone starts with the same amount of money. Everyone starts with the same amount of property, which namely none. Everyone starts with the same amount of chance and community chest cards. None. Everyone starts at the same level. We're all equal. Well, as you play Monopoly, everyone is still equal in the sense that we are still all playing by the same rules, the law. We're all equal under the law. Maybe you can't really bring God into Monopoly, but, there's still equality. We all still have to play with the same dice. We have to roll the same dice. We have to move around the same board. We're governed by the same rules. But there's not equity. It becomes very apparent very quickly that there is not equity. In fact, equity is something that is impossible to achieve in like a game like Monopoly. One trip around the board, certain people have certain property because they bought it. Certain people don't have certain property. Some people have more money or less money because they bought more expensive property or less expensive property. Some people landed on the go to jail thing, so they ended up in jail. So it's just impossible in something as simple as Monopoly to achieve equity. Now imagine if the goal of the game of Monopoly was to achieve equity, equal outcome in the same way that we try to in our policies in America. It would be a nightmare of a game. You just think about, okay, every trip around the board, oh man, we look and see, man, this inequality has mounted. Look, everyone has the same money. So rather than when you pass go and everyone collects $200, right? That would be equality under the law. We all get $200 every trip around the board. We all get $200. But every trip around the board, whoever has the most assets, you got to count up how much all your properties are worth, how much cash you have, and then you have to count, everyone has to count, whoever has the least, you have to take from the people that have more. Either you have to sell off a property to get the money or whatever, and then distribute it. So rather than getting $200, if people have more, they have to lose their money down to be equal and then kind of raise the people back up to 200, and then you can start another go around the board. And then, of course, inequality is going to happen again because you're playing a random trading game and buying and selling and all this kind of stuff. And then you do the same thing, and it would be a pointless, meaningless game. You would be creating a Hasbro level version of tyranny to control this game, and it wouldn't be fun anymore. There is no objective at that point other than circling the board and trying to make things equitable. And so that's how our world today sees equity, and that's the policies they pursue. Now, obviously, Monopoly is a silly illustration, but it's so simple that it kind of points to, well, wait a second, that would obviously be ridiculous. Well, anytime we pursue policy decisions that are along that same vein, they're kind of equally foolish. They're not really going to achieve the ends that I think that they purport to attempt to achieve. So the world seeks after justice and equity, and we in the church seek after justice and equity. But our goals are probably not the same because the world system is controlled by Satan. We as Christians, hopefully, are governed and controlled by the Holy Spirit. And we're pursuing the things of the kingdom of heaven. And so not only are our goals probably different, and we should be very cautious if our goals are the same as the world system. So racial equality, racial equity. Why, as the church, now we as the church, as Christians, might think, okay, in our secular world, maybe race matters, but from a Christian standpoint, what does it matter whether the person I work with is white, black, Mexican, the person I worship with is white, black, Mexican, Chinese? It it shouldn't matter. Now, that doesn't mean you erase somebody's race and ethnicity or whatever, but those things should not be the ultimate goal. Maybe they should play a factor, but they shouldn't be the thing we strive for the most. So even in that, when HR departments are striving for racial equity, well, is that even a goal that we as Christians should want to pursue? Again, maybe if it happens, maybe that's nice, but maybe that shouldn't really concern us all that much. But so the goal is different, and even the way we pursue the goals that we might agree on is going to be different. So that's kind of all a sidebar. But wisdom, that's part of wisdom, right? Discerning wise counsel, as far as the Bible would determine wise counsel, is very different. It's going to be very different than the way of the world. But then, verse 4 says, to impart shrewdness to the morally naive and a discerning plan to the young person. So this morally naive, this naive person is what it's this innocent, the most innocent version of a fool in the book of Proverbs. It's the Hebrew word rather, is Peti. Again, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, P-E-T-I, transliterated in English. Peti. It's like a child. That it's somebody who's just so naive and simple, open-minded to the point of harm and destruction. But it's not necessarily a moral failing. Everyone starts in life as a naive person, as a simpleton. And we hopefully learn as we move through life, and even as you start new things, anything that you strive to be good at, when you start doing that thing, you're going to be naive at the basics of that topic or the whatever game or skill you might be trying to learn. You're going to be naive at it. You're going to be a simpleton. And you might be learning how to do a certain skill, maybe like coding in a computer software, and you're so ignorant that anyone could come in. You got to make sure you have a good instructor. If you've got somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about and they're teaching you things, you're just going to absorb it because you don't know any better. You're going to end up being a terrible software engineer because you had a foolish instructor who didn't know what he was doing, and he passed on stupid, foolish information to you, and you were so simple you got burned because you didn't know any better. So the simpleton is not somebody who is incapable of learning. However, they have to be able to be guided by wise people. Proverbs 21:11 says, when a scorner is punished, the naive, the Peti, becomes wise. When a wise person is instructed, he, the Peti, gains knowledge. So the simpleton is not incapable of learning. He will learn, and that's sometimes the point of rebuking people. When somebody is punished for something, the punishment might not only be for that person. Punishment is can be used as retribution to a person who's done wrong, right? Like a punishment in that sense. Sometimes punishment like jail or just time out for a kid is to remove them from the situation. But sometimes there are deterrence punishments, right? You might have heard in kind of civil financial lawsuits, someone will get sued for punitive damages, and that's kind of a way of punishing the company for the mistake that they should have known better not to make. But then they're also sued for deterrence damages. Now, I think in theory the point is supposed to be to deter them from ever doing it again, but that's usually when you see these lofty tens of millions of dollars lawsuits, it's usually always in damages, punitive damages, but then deterrence damages. And it's basically to slap somebody or a company down to keep them from doing that again, but also to deter other companies from making the same mistake. McDonald's brews their coffee too hot and puts faulty lids on their things or whatever, and a woman burns herself, and they get sued for millions and millions and millions of dollars. Part of that is deterrence damages, to then other companies say, okay, let's take the time and make sure we've got good equipment that we're using here, and we're not going to scald somebody and get sued for tens of millions of dollars. So that would be a Peti, a simpleton, learning through the punishment of somebody else. And the same can be true of wisdom. They see a wise person gain instruction, and they might pursue that as well. So, again, there's nothing necessarily wrong about being a simpleton, but there is danger in being a simpleton. Another category or another characteristic of a Peti in Proverbs 14 is a naive person believes everything, but the shrewd person discerns his steps. So that's like a child, right? Children are so gullible, they can be lied into anything, right? And that's why we tell kids about Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and stuff, and they don't know any better. Like, and usually you don't even have to sit kids down and tell them that they're not real. Like Santa Claus and stuff are not real. Kids usually figure that out on their own. Once they start to leave that naive, simpleton, gullible stage as a child, they start to put the pieces together. Oh, hold on, wait a second. You're telling me this guy travels around the world in a night, comes down chimneys. What if there is no chimney? How does he get into our house? It just doesn't make any sense. And they kind of figure it out on their own. And usually then in that phase, parents kind of try to play along a little bit and keep the magic alive or whatever. I've heard parents, they kind of try to keep that lie going, and just because they don't, it kind of shows like an innocence, a simpler time where kids, were a little bit more innocent. So I can see why parents might want to keep that going, because that's the innocence of a child, and that simple, gullibleness of a child that's kind of cute. That's that slipping away. But that's a good thing. We shouldn't disparage children from learning and maturing in that way. It's a good thing, but that's why it's so important. And obviously the Proverbs has a lot to say about parenting and raising and training children, but that's why parents have to be very cautious about what they are teaching their children. Okay? Because kids will believe anything. And if you're not careful, your kids will grow up and start to unlearn things that you taught them because they just assumed it was, silly superstition that they were cowed into believing as a child. And then other people can come in and teach them things that they're still gullible and moldable. And so it's your job as a parent to obviously protect and to discipline. Yes, discipline in the sense of training. That's probably more what the Proverbs has in mind when we talk about disciplining children. And then the other thing the Proverbs says about a naive person, in Proverbs 27:12, it says, "A shrewd person sees danger and hides himself, but the naive keep right on going, and they suffer for it." And we'll see the example that's used in Book of Proverbs, chapter 7 and chapter 9. The fool, the naive, is just so airheaded. He just can't see 2 steps into the future to see, oh, wait a second, I'm headed down a wrong path. Whereas a shrewd person, a wise person, can project him or herself into the future and say, okay, if I keep pursuing this path, there's going to be destruction and damage. And wise people learn from previous mistakes. Either the mistakes of other people or the mistakes that they've made. They learn, if I do this, this is going to happen. And so then they stop doing that thing because they know it's in a simpleton is just incapable of learning from past mistakes. So they can't see danger coming. They just walk right ahead. And then that brings us to this illustration. I won't read the whole passage. Take a look at Proverbs chapter 7 sometime. You've got the adulterous woman. As the net says, the wiles of the harlot. And Solomon, presumably it's Solomon, saying he looked out his window through the window lattice, and I saw among the naive, the Peti, I discerned among the youths a young man who lacked wisdom. So here you've got a Peti. You've got a foolish, simple-minded person just wandering through the streets. And it says, he was passing by the street near her, this prostitute's corner, making his way along the road to her house in the dark. And it says, suddenly she came out to meet him, dressed like a prostitute with secret intent. She's loud, rebellious. She doesn't remain at home. At one time outside, another in the wide plazas. In every corner she lies in wait. And it says she grabbed him and kissed him with bold expression. She said to him, I have fresh meat at home today. This is why I've come out to meet you. I've spread my bed with elegant coverings, with rich colored fabric. I've perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes. She's really trying to, seduce this guy with all of the perfume, I guess, that she's put on her bed. And I guess she says she's got meat, so I guess that's good. She's trying to win him through his stomach. My husband's not at home. He's gone away. I'm like, come on. Oh, and it says she persuaded him with persuasive words. And suddenly, like an ox that goes to slaughter, an arrow pierces his liver. And so it's like his life is ruined because he followed this woman. And he was so naive. An onlooker could just look at this and say, couldn't you see what was happening? How did you not see this? How could you not see? She's dressed like a prostitute. She's obviously, trying to distract you and lure you in through false motives. She's married. She tells you she has a husband. Like, oh man, like, and if, and this is kind of one of the things, this happens a lot in our culture where, a person will have an affair and the person who was a part of the affair thinks, oh, this person really loves me. Without thinking, well, wait a second. They made commitments and vows to their spouse. Why would I think that anything's different with me? What has changed? They're obviously revealing something about their character. And so you see this, man, and it's so heartbreaking to see. But you probably know people, and maybe you are this way or have been this way, that they just go from bad relationship to bad relationship to bad relationship. These toxic relationships. And they never stop to think, why is this happening? Why do I keep choosing these kinds of people? And they never have any kind of introspection, no kind of learning to figure out, is it something with me? Am I a bad chooser? And oftentimes it gets internalized and they end up going down a path, a downwards cycle of continuing to choose wrong guys because they get, depressed and they think that they're not worth anything better than that. It's just a really bad destructive cycle, but it's really just naivety. It starts as being a simpleton, not being willing to just stop, look ahead and say, okay, well, hold on, oh man, like this relationship that I'm possibly walking into, they've had nothing but toxic relationships over and over and over and again, breakup after breakup after breakup, and man, it always seems to be somebody else's fault too, like, and you kind of start to learn these things, like, oh, wait a second, like, maybe it's that person that's the problem. Maybe I shouldn't get into a relationship with that person. Maybe they're the problem. But the naive, he's not able to discern that. This woman meets him out on the street corner. She's cooked him a nice steak. She doesn't know him from Adam. She's just out there trying to, basically pick up a John. It sounds like, get a client. And this guy thinks, oh, she just loves me so much. It's foolishness. It's naivety. But you can contrast that with chapter 9, Proverbs 9, where it talks about wisdom has built her house. She's carved out her 7 pillars. She's prepared her meat. She's mixed her wine, has arranged her tables. She sends out her servants and calls, verse 4, whoever is naive, let him turn and hear. Whoever lacks understanding, come eat my food. Come drink some of my wine. Abandon your foolish ways so that you may live. Proceed in the way of understanding. So here you've got 2 women, kind of this adulterous woman personified in this character. And then you've got wisdom personified. Both have their home. Both have food to offer, drink to offer, things to allure young people in. And you kind of have this choice. Do I want to continue being naive and pursue the adulterous woman when all of the evidence points that this is a bad decision? Or do I want to abandon my naivety and do I want to choose wisdom? And remember, God says, I'll give it to you freely. And so we can be more wise going forward than we are now if we just choose to take the time to ask God for wisdom. Wisdom is standing on the street corner, asking, begging for you to come in and have a meal with her. But then there's also the adulterous woman out there begging for you to come in. The naive are gullible. The Peti are so simple-minded that they're cracking their head against the wall with stupidity and foolishness. So abandon your foolish ways. And our culture would do so well if they just heeded this warning to abandon foolishness and simple naivety. So much of the problems that I think people fall into is just simple, foolish naivety, not thinking about, and I include myself in this. I'm not above this by any means. It's just not thinking, just taking a second to try to think logically, but rather we reason like children. I just want to do this thing. It's going to feel good. It seems like a good idea. It seems smart. It's like, well, what do you know? You don't know anything. You're just a naive Peti, and you need to learn humility and seek wise counsel. And that wise counsel comes obviously from the Holy Spirit and from God's Word, but it also comes from other people. People who just know something that you don't know. And so that's my challenge to you. It's my challenge to myself. As I have started this teaching on the book of Proverbs, maybe we'll revisit it in future podcast episodes as I'm working through this book. But this version of foolishness, the Peti, the simple, naive person, we're all this in some ways. We all start out this way. Hopefully we've learned and grew into adult thinking in many areas, but we're always foolish and naive in certain areas. Whenever we try to do something new or learn a new skill, new task, new relationships, we're foolish and naive. So we need wisdom, and God offers it to us freely if we will just ask for it. While Faith in Focus is a ministry of In Faith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission. If you like what you heard on this episode, why don't you become a monthly supporter of the ministry? It really helps me out. $10 a month or whatever the Lord lays on your heart. So if you're interested in becoming a partner, you can text the word discipleship to 41444 or head over to infaith.org/Dennis-Southerby. And if you have any questions or topics that you would like me to address on a future episode of Faith in Focus, why don't you shoot me an email? You can email me at dennissoutherby@infaith.org. Just put in the subject line, question for Faith in Focus or something like that. So I can see it, know that it's from you, and know that it's an issue that you would like me to address.